So thank you all for being here. Good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on where you're joining us from. My name is Kim Thorson. I currently serve as chair at Amnesty International Edmonton. My pronouns are she and her. So welcome one and all. Amnesty Edmonton begins every event with a diversity welcome and this land acknowledgement. As an act of reconciliation, we acknowledge that we are indebted to live on the land of the displaced Papas-Chase Nation and colonized Treaty 6 territory known as Amiskwaciy-Waskahikan. That's Cree for Beaver Hills House, also known as Edmonton. And Roy is joining us from Tel Aviv, Israel. At this event, we welcome Indigenous peoples, including Métis, people of Latinx, African, Arab, Asian, South Asian, Pacific Islander, European descent, and people of mixed descents. People of all genders and identities, those who identify as having a disability, visible or invisible, all bodies, all ages, survivors, migrants and refugees, people who identify as activists and people who don't, people of all religious faiths, the many ways people in the space have gained knowledge, those who have acquired it formally or informally through experience, those who support you being here, our elders, those here in this room, in our lives, and those who've passed away. We acknowledge the historical process of oppression of lands and cultures and believe that only by doing our work in defending human rights in an intentional, deliberate, and thoughtful manner in consultation with rights holders can meaningfully contribute to the healing and decolonizing journey we all share together. We're honored to have you join us today and to give us that most precious of gifts, your time. Before we begin, I'd like to take care of a couple of housekeeping items and to gently remind all of us about how we show up today. The chat is disabled for this meeting. Chats will only be able to be sent to the host. Please keep all questions respectful and appropriate. Anyone that is behaving in a disrespectful or inappropriate manner will be removed immediately from the event. Should you have any technical issues, draw your attention to the reactions icon at the bottom of your screen. Use the raise hand feature and one of our hosts will message you as soon as possible. After Roy's remarks, we will have a bit of time for a Q&A. If you have questions for Roy, please use that raise hand feature. One of our moderators will collect your questions for the Q&A session and we'll try to get to as many as possible. This event is hosted collaboratively by TSELEM, Palestine Solidarity Network, and Amnesty International Edmonton. TSELEM is a Jerusalem-based nonprofit organization whose stated goals are to document human rights violations in the Israeli-occupied Palestinian territories, combat any denial of the existence of such violations, and help create a human rights culture in Israel. The Palestine Solidarity Network is a nonprofit grassroots organization aimed at advocating for and upholding the human rights of Palestinians in the face of ongoing oppression, occupation, racism, and discrimination, both in occupied Palestine and in the diaspora. Amnesty International Edmonton is part of a worldwide movement of over 2 million people who campaign for and defend internationally recognized human rights for all. Amnesty Edmonton is a small group of volunteers, and I'm honored to be part of this team. And now I'll pass the virtual mic to Amnesty Edmonton member Rob Normey to introduce our speaker.
Thanks, Kim. And welcome everyone who's joined us. And again, thanks very much, Roy. We're very much looking forward to your presentation. I'll just give a brief introduction. And I wanted to indicate that we decided it would be worth our while to try to contact TSELEM and ultimately invite Roy to speak after speaking at our recent Amnesty meeting, talking about Amnesty reports, in particular the report on apartheid against Palestinians. And I wanted to emphasize that I'm familiar with the work of TSELEM, although others in the group, some others did not seem aware of it. So I thought it'd be most worthwhile for our members to hear from Roy. And of course, we want to offer the opportunity to others as well. And I think back to my visit to Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories in the 80s. And I've been interested in human rights around the globe, in Latin America in particular, but also in Israel and Palestine since that time as a member of Amnesty. So it's been a great opportunity to speak to Roy, to hear his enthusiasm. And when I indicated that Canada's Foreign Affairs Minister was fairly dismissive of the Amnesty International report. It was Roy who indicated that, well, in the human rights community, we know that we're doing work that is going to have a positive impact over time. And so I welcome that optimism and that enthusiasm. TSELEM is the Israeli Information Center for Human Rights in the occupied territories. And on its site, it indicates it strives for a future in which human rights, liberty, and equality are guaranteed to all people, Palestinian and Jewish alike, living between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean. Such a future will only be possible when the Israeli occupation and apartheid regime end. That's the future the organization works towards. TSELEM is a Hebrew term in the image of, comes from Genesis. And the name expresses the universal and Jewish moral edict to respect and uphold the human rights of all people. So one can learn a great deal from the site, including the purpose of TSELEM, but also the many reports, excellent reports on human rights that it publishes. Roy himself, before joining TSELEM as Director of Public Outreach, ran his own consulting business for strategic communication and political campaigns. He was campaign manager for the Meretz Party in 2013, its successful elections campaign. He's also worked with another important Israeli human rights group, Yesh Din, and has worked with Breaking the Silence, important civil society organization, the Tel Aviv Museum, the Kamarai Theater, ELA, Recycling Corporation, the Jewish Music Center, the Women's Coalition for Peace, and the Julia Stasek Collection. So without further ado, I'm happy to introduce Roy and hear him speak on the great work that TSELEM does.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. I hope that I have interesting things to tell you. Thank you for the introduction and for presenting the organization I work for. TSELEM, I want to give just like a little bit more about what we do, so you have a better like concept of where we come from. We're an information center. We're not, unlike other human rights organizations, we do little litigation. We don't go to the courts. What we do is document violations of human rights and we publish them. And the purpose was that, of the founders of TSELEM, was the thinking that 30 years ago, that if Israelis mainly will get information about the type of violations that Israel enacts in the territories it occupied, they will be morally outraged and they will act to end them. And of course, that was partly accurate. It was part of the puzzle, but it wasn't enough. And that really brings me to what I want to talk about tonight, like what we're lacking in our struggle to make the place that I live in, Palestine, Israel, a place where everybody can feel safe and secure and have a home and have their human rights respected, have political voice, have a place to leave, but also a place to come back to move freely, all those things that are, really essential for us for realizing our humanity. And for many, many years, we thought that we're dealing with occupation, and that is even in our descriptor, in our name. We're the Israeli Information Center for Human Rights in the Occupied Territories. But over the years, we understood that this is not enough, and how it came to be. Thomas Kuhn, in his book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, explains how a paradigm shift happens in science. And it happens when more and more data is collected that doesn't match your theory, your scientific theory. So if you think the Earth is flat, and you see more and more observations that stand in contradiction to that, you either find very, very ridiculous explanations for what your eyes and senses and observational tools are finding, or you change your theory and find a better explanation that is better and closer to reality. And to a large extent, that's what happened for us with apartheid. Occupation in international law, belligerent occupation, is defined as a temporary situation in which the human rights of the occupied population is suspended until the normal, which is self-rule, returns. And when TSELEM was founded 30 years ago, during the days of the first Intifada, everybody believed that the occupation is temporary, and that what the mission statement of my organization has to do with fixing things in the meantime until political solution to the conflict arrives. 30 years have passed, and starting around 2000 or roughly there, the organization that was before I joined 7 years ago. The organization had to change the language. So saying prolonged occupation, protracted occupation, non-temporary occupation, and over the years changed that into one state reality, and challenging the fact that Israel is perceived as a democracy. So the common perception, which is still prevalent today, not among human rights groups. I think that in the human rights community, we now have a consensus regarding a regime of apartheid, or the crime of apartheid, depends on your analysis and focus. But in the international community, I think if we're talking about Canada, United States, Western countries in general, most of the world, they view the situation in Israel-Palestine as a dual regime system, in which in Israel you have a permanent democracy, where it's rather like liberal and people are voting, and you have all the rules of a functioning system, a democratic system, rather open society. While in the West Bank, you have a military occupation, but this is not a permanent feature of the Israeli regime. However, last month, in 5th of June, we marked the 55th year of the occupation. And we also, if we're looking at the Israeli data regarding the number of Israeli Jewish settlers that reside beyond the Green Line within the territory that Israel occupied in 1967, it's over 700,000 people. If we're looking at the fact that Israel has declared many times, leaders like Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, the current Prime Minister Bennett, that no political process is at sight, and that Israel will not accept a Palestinian state alongside it. The report and growing political support for official annexation, which will not really change much on the ground, because for all purposes, Israel already de facto annexed the West Bank. If you take all those under consideration, then you have to ask yourself, so what regime are we looking at? And most and foremost, and the most important thing, is to understand that there's one government that is controlling all the area. And this government sits in Jerusalem, and it's being chosen by only half of the populations that it controls. And how that comes, so I just like the breakout of the numbers, there are roughly 14 million people living between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. 7 million are Jews, and 7 million are Palestinians. Roughly around 1 million Palestinians have Israeli citizenship, so they can vote to the Knesset, but the rest of the Palestinians cannot. And when we were really like having to do this like word juggling and use lots of euphemism in order to describe reality, we kind of thought that, okay, maybe we have to devote some thinking into a better description of what we're seeing. And we went into a research that took several years to look at different models of regimes and that will better fit our understanding and perception of reality. And what we came to understand is that over the time, the distinction between the two regimes is really divorced from reality. The state of affairs that existed for over 50 years, which is, longer than the time that Israel has existed without controlling the occupied territories. We understood, as I said, that there are hundreds of thousands of people that live permanently outside of the boundaries of the sovereign state of Israel. Somehow, miraculously, there's a legal system that allows them to enjoy all the privileges of Israeli citizenship. They participate in the elections, they receive social security and healthcare. And there is Israeli police there in their settlements that is making sure that they're safe and to make sure that, civilian disputes don't get out of hand. They have freedom of movement to and from where they reside. They have banks that are financing mortgages for them to build their houses and to expand them. All of this exists outside of the sovereign state of Israel. So just like fathom in mind, we're like a Canadian that is, I don't know, residing in Ireland, but he receives like services from the Canadian government as if he lives in Edmonton. On top of that, Israel has annexed illegally East Jerusalem. In East Jerusalem, we have roughly 280,000 Palestinian residents that are under Israeli sovereignty, but they are denied political rights. They cannot vote for the Israeli parliament. They can participate in the municipal elections for the Jerusalem Authority. However, a large chunk of them don't receive any type of services from this municipality because Israel has built a wall within their neighborhoods that is kind of throws them in a exterritorial zone in terms of cleaning, picking up the trash, or building schools for their children, etc. Taking all this under consideration, and also the fact that our mandate is rather limited because we are focused on what happens in the West Bank, we said, okay, we really can't continue with this anymore, and we have to expand our and look at the forest and not at the trees. And what we came to understand after researching similar types of violations that we document within the West Bank and Gaza, also within the Israeli, the Israeli boundaries or sovereign area, is that there's one principle by which the Israeli regime is controlling the entire area. And this principle is, working for the benefit of the Jews at the expense of Palestinians. And it doesn't matter whether those Palestinians live within the sovereign state of Israel or outside of it. Still, they are secondary in class and in rights to a Jewish Israeli. And we elaborate on that in several main areas. There are more, but we are focusing on the main areas where a state is really that prove the existence of a system that wants to perpetuate and exacerbate the domination of one group over another. And this is the definition, by the way, of apartheid. Apartheid is a regime in which one group, one racial group, and racial doesn't mean that we acknowledge race as a thing other than a social construct. We don't believe that race is something that is really exists. There are phenotypic differences between people in their color, their whatever, but it doesn't mean that they have belonged to a race. It's a social construct, but it's for the purpose of the definition of so political science and the crime of apartheid, we recognize it as such. So it's a regime in which one racial group wants to perpetuate its domination over another by means of law and organized violence. So if we're looking at Israel-Palestine, let's look first in the question of who can live here and who can become a citizen and enjoy civil rights. So any Jew, no matter where they were born, their children, their grandchildren, their spouses, can immigrate to Israel whenever they want and receive Israeli citizenship, no questions asked. And that also, they will receive this citizenship and all the privileges that are given within it, even if they choose to reside in the West Bank, so outside of the boundaries of the State of Israel. In contrast, non-Jews have no right for legal status in Israeli-controlled areas, and the status is granted on the sole discretion of decision makers in the Ministry of Interior. And that means that Palestinians, even those that were born here, lived here, their children cannot come and immigrate to areas controlled by Israel. And this has even even by marrying Palestinians, they cannot do that. So even the right for family is denied from Palestinians. Now, Israel not only blocks Palestinian immigration, it also impedes Palestinian relocation between the several units that it controls. As I said, apartheid means separation, apart. And what Israel does in order to secure the Jewish domination is to divide Palestinians to different enclaves and political units. So we have Palestinians that have Israeli citizenship. They have the most full package of rights, which is not the same as the rights of a Jewish Israeli, but it's closer. You have residents of East Jerusalem that have a permanent residency status, but not citizenship. So they can reside in Israel. They have relative freedom of movement in and out of the country because they have a permanent residency status. But they cannot vote and politically participate, and they are not, and of course, they're not equal. Then you have the people that live in the West Bank. They are stateless, essentially. They have no civil rights, and they have no protection whatsoever. Also, there are a lot of violations that they suffer from just by the fact that they live in the West Bank. And you can read about a lot of them in on our website. Essentially, even this separation is sub-separation into different categories of people that reside in A, B, and C areas that were designated in the interim Oslo Accord. And that means that their right to build, to move freely between one Palestinian city to another Palestinian city is highly, highly restricted and sometimes doesn't even exist. They cannot move into Israel freely. They need a special permit in order to do so. And the permit regime even blocks them from traveling in and out of the country. So if they want to go to travel for school or to just for tourism, they need to go to the Israeli army and ask for a permit, and then go through a really laborious process of leaving the country through Allenby Junction and then fly from Jordan. They are not allowed to fly from Ben Gurion Airport unless in very rare cases. And at the bottom of this metaphoric structure of tiers, you have the people that reside in Gaza. They have zero freedom of movement. Gaza is essentially the largest open air prison in the world. There are 2 million Palestinians living there. A lot of them are rather young. So I don't know if it's like almost, I recently heard, and I don't know the exact number, so I don't, but roughly half of them have never encountered a different situation where they could even travel to the West Bank. And the restrictions are so severe that even immediate family members are not permitted to cross and see each other. And essentially, Israel is blocking Gaza from the rest of the world and blocking Gazans from seeing their other, the other chunk of Palestinian people that are not living there. And of course, outside of all that was the question of Palestinians that reside in the Palestinian diaspora, which, as I told you, cannot enter and cannot receive any kind of status in Israel. The second point is land. The greatest resource that a country has at its disposal is the land. That's like also like most of us know that buying a home is probably the largest investments most people do in their lives. And in general, the Israel policy is that land is a resource that is meant for the benefit of Jews. So there's even a word for it. In Hebrew, we say leyahed, Judaizing the land. This is still like a very overt racist thing that Israeli politicians often say. They state that there's a need to make the Galilee or the Negev, Nakab in Arabic, Jewish. And for this purpose, Israel developed and expanded Jewish communities, built over 1,000 new ones, and almost no new city or village for Palestinians. So since 1948, if we want to talk about numbers, over 1,200 Israeli villages, Israeli Jewish villages, towns, kibbutzim, etc. For the Palestinian population, only 8 new villages, and they were built only in the Negev for the sole purpose of restricting Bedouin population from living where they want. So they really like took very dispersed Bedouin communities and put them together in essentially rather sad slum towns for the purpose of really like taking over the land and giving it to Jews. And many of the political struggles within the Negev today are around the intention of Israel to displace residing communities that were there even before Israel was founded for the purpose of establishing new Jewish villages and settlements. What I was describing now is the situation within Israel, within the internationally recognized state of Israel 67 border. But the same policy is actually at play in the West Bank, and before that in Gaza, in the areas that Israel has taken in 1967. Israel has built over 200 settlements in the West Bank, including settlement points in Jerusalem. During this time, there's one new Palestinian town. It's called Rawabi. It was built essentially in the areas that were given to the Palestinian Authority, so Israel had nothing to do with that. But in the recent weeks, we are combating the right of Palestinian communities to exist and not to be forcibly displaced from their place, especially in South Hebron Hills and along the Jordan Valley. I don't know if you heard about it. It did receive some coverage in the international press, but for decades, Israel is trying to forcibly transfer or essentially expel Palestinian communities from areas that it wants to take over. It's essentially in the Jordan Valley, South Hebron Hills, which is the area between the West Bank and the south of of Israel, and also along the outskirts of Jerusalem. And it does so by creating coercive environment. So rather than putting people on trucks, things that will not be very palatable for the international media and decision makers. What it does is create an unbearable life circumstances for those Palestinians, with the hope that they will live seemingly out of their own volition and accord, but this is not the case. So how do you do that? You make their lives unbearable by, settler violence, which is unmitigated and receives impunity, by forbidding those communities from connecting to the water and electricity grid, by barring them constructing any kind of new structures for homes or for other economic reasons. So if you want to build a store or a factory or a pen for your cattle, Israel forbids that. And even if those communities organize and build solar panels or water filtration system, then Israel is demolishing that over and over and over again, kind of making it, hoping that they will give up and leave the land, and then Israel will take it over. So this is something that we're essentially really like combating in the past few weeks. And then the last like measure that Israel is using to do so, which is really like what is like receiving the attention of the media, is the fact that Israel is declaring areas within those communities as firing zone for the army. So the army is essentially conducting drills between people homes, shooting with live ammunitions and heavy machinery, destroying their crops, destroying their homes, scaring their cattle, etc. And of course, it's very, very when you have like something like wheat, which is now the season for harvest, and you have a tank going over what you essentially worked for to grow for 3 or 4 months, and then you're left with nothing. Or if you have cattle, and because of the noise of the artillery that the army is shooting, they lose their babies, you're also losing your livelihood. And this is essentially what Israel is doing. So we're talking about land, and it's the same on both within or outside of the green line. Third, restriction of Palestinian freedom of movement. Like I said, it's different for the different Palestinians in different areas, but essentially Israelis can move freely, Jews can move freely. I can go take my car, drive to the West Bank, arrive anywhere I want, with the small exception of not entering areas designated as A and B under the Oslo Accord. Those areas, and it's not for my, because Israel wants to restrict my freedom of movement, it's because of considering my safety. I do enter TSELEM, we do go to meet our friends in areas that are forbidden, but it's not allowed. So Israelis can go anywhere. Palestinians, as I said, cannot go into Israel. They cannot even go outside of Israel without asking for the Israeli military for permission, which is often denied. And last is the denial of Palestinian right for political participation. So Palestinian citizens of Israel can take political action. They participate in the Knesset. They can even participate in the government. However, key figures in Israeli politics are delegitimizing their participants. They're making it impossible for the government to rely on their votes, saying that if there's no Jewish majority, then it's not legitimate. And in addition to that, there are several legislations that is barring them from equal participation and expressing their political rights, their political identity. We just recently had big discussions about the right to wave Palestinian flags in official Israeli institutions, etc. For Palestinians in the West Bank, it's much more similar to military dictatorship. A month into the occupation in 1967, Israel forbade any type of political protest within the West Bank. So any kind of resistance to the occupation or political organization within the West Bank is forbidden by Israel, and Israel sees it like as its rights to arrest, detain, prosecute, and sometimes use even more violent means against the people that take part in those political protests. So this is like, just in broad strokes, the reasons that led us to understand that Israel is committing apartheid against Palestinians. We are talking, and our focus, our contribution to this discussion, which is now, it's more widely accepted, was really like to point out that there's no logic in analyzing the Israeli regime as a double regime. There's only one government that is acting and deciding. The Israeli army has never done a putsch against the elected government. They take their orders from the Israeli Prime Minister and Minister of Defense. And if anybody had any type of criticism of our analysis, they really have to look at the reason that the Israeli government was dissolved last week. I don't know if you know, but there's a bunch of regulations that Israel has legislated over the years to allow for the Israeli settlers, the Israeli Jewish settlers that reside outside of Israel, to enjoy all the benefits of Israeli citizenship. And the Knesset did not have the majority they have to vote on them every 5 years to renew them. And the right wing, so essentially the ones that are even further to the right than the current government, decided that in order to topple the government, they're going to vote against those regulations. And the majority, the consensus of Israeli politics said that without this apartheid system, without those regulations, I have to say, settlers will be equal to Palestinians in the West Bank. They will have to be judged in the military court system. All the other things that happen there will be the same system that Palestinians have. Israelis could not bear the thought that something like this will happen. And in a rather telling or embarrassing, depends how you look at it, a group of settlers even published a thing on social media saying that if this thing doesn't pass, then the Israeli government will act apartheid on them. So apparently they know how to name the situation where you have, when you have a second-class type of citizenship under one government. And so should we. We should really call it what it is, because to name something is to know what you're up against. And it also offers a rather different toolbox in order to change reality. And I'm addressing that because as long as Israel is perceived as a democracy, no change will happen. As long as we have the comfort of having our diplomatic ties with Israeli open society, the greatest pride parade in the Middle East, everything is fine, and business will continue to be as usual, and Palestinians will continue to live under the Israeli boot. When we understand that Israel is in fact not a democracy, it's a rather advanced country, it has a very nice economy. Part of this economy relies on the fact that it has a captive market of several million Palestinians that have to live, and like one of the only places where you cannot boycott Israeli products or Israeli services or Israeli electricity services is Palestine, because we force them to buy it from us. As long as we make this type of dual regime system the perception and narrative that is leading foreign relations, the situation will not change. But once the world recognizes the fact of apartheid and act accordingly, including consequences for a regime that is illegitimate and operates in constant violence on millions of people, then Israelis, which are normal people, not better nor worse than others, will have to recalculate and recalibrate their policy, and they will probably choose to dismantle apartheid. And I'm happy, and thank you again for letting me talk to you, and I'm happy to take your questions now.
Great. Thanks very much, Roy. And I was going to sort of set up the questions that people can pose to you by just saying a few more words about going back, I guess, to our discussion at our Amnesty International meeting on our human rights reports, and particularly on our report on apartheid. And Kim had said, well, let's just do a quick highlight of that. And what I wanted to do is place it together with TSELEM's report on apartheid, which is available on your website, as you say. And I think that's important. You've mentioned, Roy, what it amounts to. And it's important, of course, to emphasize that it's a crime under international law. It's a crime against humanity. It's very serious. It's something that is described and proscribed under the Apartheid Convention, the Rome Statute, and customary international law. So where inhuman and inhumane acts and serious human rights violations, extreme forms of racial discrimination are perpetrated in the context of an institutionalized regime of this, to this degree of oppression and domination, the international order it can only be preserved if we first register what is going on under this complete system. As you say, it extends from within Israel across to the occupied Palestinian territories. The human rights community has worked very diligently to investigate and to compile the statistics, do the research, interview the individuals involved to reach conclusions. And what I see in the media and amongst a number of political figures is they simply want to treat the conclusions of the TSELEM report and the Amnesty report on apartheid as no more than something like the expression of an opinion in a news magazine newsletter, whereas in fact, our report is a landmark, powerful report that does reach its conclusions through painstaking research. It's documented. It's not merely an expression of opinion. So the questions that should be asked are not, do you think Israel is now an apartheid state, but rather, having read the reports of TSELEM, Human Rights Watch, Al-Haq, Yes Din, also an Israeli human rights group, more recently the UN Special Rapporteur Michael Link, all of these reports reach very firm conclusions. So while people can certainly question some of the methodology if they wish, look at the statistics, wonder about the nature of the research, unless they've got those sorts of issues, they really need to grapple seriously with the conclusions as documented conclusions about a state of affairs, about an institutionalized regime that is contrary to international law. The Amnesty report, 4 years in the making, deals with all of the matters you've been talking about, the fragmentation of the Palestinian national community into domains of control by the state of Israel, dispossession of land and property, segregation on a number of fronts. Of course, a visible reminder of that for anybody studying Israel and Palestine is the separation wall or barrier. That was reviewed at the international level and found to be, as it snakes through occupied Palestine, as contrary to international law. But it's a visible reminder of a separation between races. There's a deprivation of economic and social rights. In the Amnesty report, which I urge members to read, others who are interested in human rights issues that arise, Amnesty starts, for instance, with the example of Sheikh Jarrah, and maybe Roy, you'd want to talk on that briefly, a neighborhood in East Jerusalem, occupied East Jerusalem, where at one time there was a threat of evictions, and those have now been carried out. But Amnesty in its report carries through those news items are something that will be fresh in a number of people's minds. But if one sees that as this part of this overall system that's been going on for decades, and a system whereby the ability to take effective action to protest is severely restricted by the state of Israel. This illustrates fairly graphically, the level of oppression that the system of oppression that the apartheid regime creates. So that's documented in the Amnesty reports. It's well worth looking at. And again, the report references international law in a number of places. One thing that Roy, you may also want to talk about is the issue of colonialism. The UN Special Rapporteur, Michael Link, did indicate that there is, of course, a link between the reason for creating this regime of oppression and domination and the ultimate ends is essentially a colonial rule in the occupied Palestinian territories. And you referred to that, Roy, when you've indicated that what was meant to be a temporary occupation has become something very different. Many have referred to the situation as a de facto annexation. And of course, not that long ago, Prime Minister Netanyahu was speaking very frankly about his plans to formally annex at some point parts of the occupied Palestinian territories. Now, the Amnesty report goes further and, of course, calls for various actions that can be taken, as does your group, TSELEM, by the international community. It's quite clear that there is simply no way that within the state of Israel at this present time, reform could come on its own. So the international community must advocate for actions to be taken, which are urgent in nature, and they're also the recommendations on what actions can be taken are all set forth in our report. With those actions, we can move towards the type of positive future that TSELEM was set up in 1989 to create, and that many of us who visited there, who want the best for both the Jewish and Palestinian people, can see happening. But the ability, the need to pressure the state of Israel is graphically illustrated by events we're seeing. One other thing I'm going to talk about before turning it over to questions was the recent killing of the great Palestinian journalist Shireen Abu Akleh. After that happened, there was a suggestion that perhaps Palestinians had been responsible for her death, but work by TSELEM on the ground established that could not have been the case based on the coordinates that your group identified, and that assisted in properly structuring the investigation of her death. So that very recently illustrates the important work that a group like TSELEM can do. And finally, given within this context of oppression, I note that 6 Palestinian human rights groups have been designated as terrorist groups in what appears to many of us to be simply an attempt to seriously interfere with their ability to do their work. That means that groups like TSELEM will have even a more important role to do in the future. But we're going to open it up to questions now. And I'm happy if you wanted to first maybe address that question about Sheikh Jarrah as an example of the way the structure works to oppress Palestinian people.
Okay, so just like in really like telegraphic notes, in Sheikh Jarrah, Jewish property can be demanded to be returned to its original owners if they have a deed for it. If there is no original owner that can prove that but there's like a proof that it belonged to Jews, some other Jewish entity can claim that property, and that has happened in Sheikh Jarrah. On the contrary, Palestinian property that Israel has taken after forcibly displace Palestinians from their homes in the time of establishment of Israel in 1948 can never be returned to their original owners. So what happened is that at the period of time between 1948 and 1967 in Sheikh Jarrah, the Jordanians gave houses to refugees, Palestinians that were displaced from their original places of residence within what was then declared the State of Israel. And they were given houses in Sheikh Jarrah. And then after 67, after the annexation of Jerusalem, etc., settler organizations claimed the places where those refugees were living as their own. And the Israeli courts repeatedly said that, like, well, this is the law, you have to give them back. While at the same time, there's a law that bars the same refugee families from claiming the property that is theirs from Israel. So you really can see just to what extent this type of system that is discriminating and unjust is at play, helping to, on one hand, to dispossess people, and on the other hand, to give this property to Jews. In the case of Sheikh Jarrah, it's also rather, very blatant, because some of those settler families come from North America. They have a very, American accent, and it's very clear that they were not living there for many years. So it's just.
Thank you so much, Roy, for all your remarks and for taking that first question. We have quite a few questions that have been lining up here for you. So I'm just going to pick one here. This question is from Heather. Heather says, I really appreciate how clearly you laid out the evidence for apartheid and differences in treatment between Jewish and Palestinian people living in different places. Do you feel things have gotten better or worse over the past few years? And has there been a change with the election of Biden in the US? And what, if anything, gives you hope for a better future?
I don't think that things are getting worse just by the fact of not getting better, because we have to understand that a situation where people are denied rights for decades is really it amounts to getting worse even if nothing happens. But some things do happen. Israeli society is becoming more racist, more close-minded. There's more hatred. There's more violence. There's more impunity for people that use violence, whether they be Israeli soldiers or Israeli civilians, if this violence is enacted against Palestinians. And that's true if the violence is enacted against Palestinians within Israel or outside of it, i.e. in the occupied territories. And regarding Biden, sadly, the American administration has showed that it has zero interest in dealing with the situation or changing policy. If the United States would have wanted to address the issue, the Israeli occupation would have been over many, many years ago. But rather than doing that, the United States is bankrolling the occupation. They simply don't care. And it doesn't seem like the Biden administration is any different. They have nicer demeanor than the rather blatant, revolting way the previous administration has expressed itself, but putting a nicer face on a disgusting policy is not a huge help.
Right. Thank you so much, Roy. Jeff, did you want to pick another question?
Sure. There's two that are kind of related here. I'm not sure who they're from. One is, what is the climate within Israel for activists like yourself working on human rights Palestinian issues? And a second question that came in related to that, are you or your organization facing any resistance on or harassment?
So as you can imagine, we are not super popular with our government. They incite against us. They are trying to pass laws that will make our life more difficult. Maybe sometimes it's just like bureaucratic harassment, like having to fill out more forms on everything we do than other type of organizations. So any organization that works on the rights of Palestinians or asylum seekers has to do like a very heavy reporting on donations and on finance and on everything, and that's just like a mean of bureaucratic torture for our financial officer. But for the time being, I can't really say that we're the victims here. We're an Israeli organization, and the importance of what we do is that we use the privileges that we have as Jewish Israelis to protect the people that really don't have those privileges, which are Palestinians. And as was mentioned here before, the most important thing we can do is like express solidarity and defy the government declaration and rules. So if 6 colleagues from 6 Palestinian colleague organization or sister organizations from Palestinian civil society were wrongly declared as terrorist organization with ties to the Popular Front, ridiculous, declaration that is nothing more than political silencing of dissenting voices, and in particular, Palestinian organizations that were involved in pressing or promoting the indictment of Israeli crimes in international courts. We can express our solidarity with them. It's forbidden by law. Because showing solidarity, it's expressing solidarity with terror, can land you a few years in jail. We openly challenge that. We published even on the paper that we don't believe our government, that we know those people for many years. We've been working with them. We know that they are human rights defenders, and we know that the Israeli military system and Minister of Defense are liars. And I think that the purpose of having us is for us to use our privileges in that way, also understanding that it will be far more difficult for Israel to throw me in jail than it is to throw a Palestinian in jail, because because of Islamophobia and because there is Palestinian resistance to the occupation, it will be much more easy for the international community to believe the Israeli lies. However, when it's somebody like me with my not so impressive terrorist history, it will be more difficult to justify, and it will show that it's just like measures that are taken against political dissent. That said, I think the future is not rosy. I think the more we challenge the Israeli policy, the more difficult it becomes for the Israeli regime to justify the mounting international criticism. And if there is a reason to be optimist, despite all those rather negative trends, is the fact that the world in general, not including the American Supreme Court, is going in a more in expanding rights direction, in understanding racial structural racism, in understanding, and this is addresses like if you're talking about colonialism, apartheid is the result of colonialism. It's what you have when you had a colonialism regime and it needs to do something with the area, then you build an apartheid regime. It started in South Africa with the British and Dutch colonists. And when the British Empire left, and after they beat up the Boers, you ended up with an apartheid regime. So I think we have a post-colonial world. The world is not white. White supremacy, like Jewish supremacy, is not the future of this planet. And this is why I'm very optimistic, because I know that this regime cannot last forever.
Roy, it's so good to hear you say that you're optimistic, because of the news from the United States Supreme Court, among other things. I'm not feeling super optimistic this morning, but it's very interesting to hear your comments on that. There's always been a lot of rumors about apartheid in South Africa was modeled after the residential school system in Canada. And I don't know how true those are, but I often see parallels between the Israel and Palestinians and Canada and Indigenous peoples. Do you have any comments on that?
I think without making analogies, we can't really think, because we need to compare things we know to things we don't know in order to kind of, grapple with them and to wrap our heads around that. So no things are similar or identical, but there are, humans are similar everywhere, and the solutions that they find are often similar. And what changes is just the level of technology. So I've visited South Africa to learn about apartheid, and more than that, to learn about the struggle against apartheid several times. And my impression was that actually apartheid was more modeled on Nazi Germany and the racial discrimination there than on anything else around the world. And if you look at the group that was the militia group that was most impactful in resisting the dismantling of apartheid in South Africa, you will see that their flag is rather similar to the swastika flag of the Third Reich. But means of control are means of control. And if we are looking at something now, is that technology is making the control far more insidious than it has been before. And Israel has an apartheid 3.0. It has a lot of technological means to enter the cell phones of Palestinians and to collect their facial recognition feature. So when they pass a roadblock or even drive their cars, they are constantly monitored. And this is like the trend that is really scary. I think like we have to rather really like think about this rather dystopian situation where you have a high-tech nation with really like fantastic creative brains, and also a lot of people that have no civil rights and ability to resist them being a sort of lab rats for this technology.
Jeff, did you have another question prepped?
Go ahead if you've got one. Andy.
Okay, I have a question. This is an anonymous question for Roy. How do you respond to those who remain neutral on the subject of Israel and Palestine, or claim that it is too complex and that they don't understand it well enough to form an opinion?
Well, smarter people than me said that neutrality in the face of things like that is actually choosing the side of the oppressor. It was Desmond Tutu who said that. So it really ties up into the subject of apartheid. Learn. I mean, it's not complicated. It's very easy. The material is readily available. Amnesty has a website, so does TSELEM, so does Human Rights Watch. You can read about it in Wikipedia. And I think every human being has an innate ability to recognize what is right and what is wrong. We know that, we can just like see, and it's easier when it's even easier when you're not part of this conflict. So like when I'm talking to you know, high school students here in Israel, I can see why it's more difficult for them to understand the situation and to see or analyze reality the way that I do. I think they were brought up in a certain narrative, and it's very difficult for them to empathize and to look at it from a more neutral point of view. But for somebody who doesn't live here, come on, it's just like, you don't need to understand a lot or know a lot, and saying that it's too complex is a cop-out.
Thank you, Roy. This may be somewhat related. This is another question that we have here. How do you respond to organizations and individuals who claim that any criticism of Israel's human rights record is anti-Semitic?
As I look at it as a really like severe offense against my family history. I think that if anything we have to learn as Jews is that human rights criticism is essential and that it protects us. And as like, and even now, Jews are a very small minority in the world. And if we don't fight for human rights for everyone and for equality, then it's endanger us and makes the world a scary place for all of us. So like even this claim is apart from being like wrong, it's very dangerous for us as a small people that has suffered, unfortunately, many chapters in history where we were prosecuted.
Thank you, Roy. I really appreciate that response. I feel that really deep in my heart. That's so true. Jeff, do you have another question ready?
Yeah, I'll try and tie two together here again. This is from Michael. He asks, in a recent article, the author concludes that the upcoming election, no matter which government comes to power, there will be no change on the horizon. There will just be more apartheid. And if we want something different, we have to look elsewhere. The pressure for change has to come from outside. How would you respond to this? And I would add to that, it's kind of a question of strategy, and it's something that I think you know, organizations like ours grapple with all the time. What is the best strategy? Where do we direct our efforts? Do you educate the general public? Do you target governments here, you know, in Canada? Do you have any thoughts about that? It's kind of
so yes. I think the coming, if we're looking at Israeli elections, this is exactly our, it really depends who gets to vote. I had, a few years ago, I had a meeting with a German politician, an important German politician. And at the end of the meeting, it was a group of Israeli human rights organizations that deal with the occupation that he met. And at the end of the meeting, he said, like, you know, everything you said is like, makes so much sense. And this is like really like where I feel like we share the same values as you do. And how come you are unable to persuade the Israeli population that you're right? And I thought to myself, oh my God, how can somebody get elected to such high position and be so incredibly stupid? Because we do have a majority here. If you ask all the people that reside between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea whether Palestinians receive full human rights, you will have a resounding majority that will say yes. The question is that you only ask less than half of the people that reside here about that. And if you ask the white people whether they should stop owning slaves, you will get like bad results. As long as the people are not everybody has a political voice, the situation doesn't change. And what we have here is highly asymmetrical situation where the world expect Israelis Jewish Israelis out of their own volition to give up their privileges, which doesn't make sense without outside pressure. So the pressure can come in several ways, and we prefer that it comes in a non-violent way, diplomatic, economic, etc. There are other ways of pressure which are not so nice, but they're also effective and proved effective in other places around the world. But power doesn't, nobody's just like handing down their power out of their own volition. You need to use, there needs to be another like interest involved. And assuming that the Israeli public will change or vote for something else doesn't really make sense.
Thank you so much, Roy. I have a question from Kathy. I don't know if you're going to know the answer to this question, but has Canada ever acknowledged this terrible administration of Israeli oppression?
There were some, very polite words of condemnation to very specific acts sometimes. But in general, Canada was very silent and ineffective in regards to that issue in general. And also it is our experience that whenever you have like a Canadian representative in Tel Aviv, which is more, open to listen, they get the message from higher in the hierarchy that maybe they shouldn't be so interested in this issue, and probably go on to stressing how wonderful the life in Tel Aviv is and what wonderful economic cooperation we can achieve together. And it is lovely, by the way. Tel Aviv is very nice. It's like, that part is true.
It looks beautiful. I wish I could say I'd been there. Thank you so much. I don't see any more questions popping up or coming in through my email or anything like that. I do want to post, I'm posting in the chat a link to Amnesty's Canada's site, which has some actions that people can take in terms of letter writing and pressure on the Israeli government. But I would also really encourage everyone to write to our own government in Canada here as well, just to, demand that the Canadian government take the position of human rights on this issue. And so, it looks like Rob, you have one more question.
I'm going to just ask the question then. I was going to say, firstly, in terms of neutrality, you can't be neutral on a moving train. And I think the train on Israel, Palestine, and the treatment of Palestinians is moving towards a disaster. Now, I'm quite familiar, and the Amnesty report, and of course, TSELEM's reporting talks about the lack of an opportunity for a fair trial, and particularly in the occupied Palestinian territories, the military court process, a massively high conviction rate, which bespeaks of no real possibility for fair trials. What about legal strategies from here in Canada or from other nations outside of Israel that might lead to the type of pressure, to the type of recognition that Israel is violating international law? And I'm thinking outside of the International Criminal Court, where matters are heading, at least in certain respects. But here in Canada, let's.
So I don't know. This entire trend of, there was like for a few years there was a trend of universal jurisdiction on war crimes around the world, and there was a talk about Israeli officials being detained and held for trial in several countries after people were filing complaints about them. That trend has stopped. Like, nobody wants to do that apparently. So I think we're left with the investigation in the ICC. I can't know, I'm not an expert on the ICC, but it seems like things there take a very, 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 I don't have enough, very long time. So we're talking about Palestinians waiting another, I don't know how many years for justice and human rights, and that is unacceptable. The other thing that I want to say is that, and I think we're in a day where it's very profusely clear to everyone that human rights struggles are political, and sometimes you can't solve a political problem with a legal strategy. And for us, it has been, this understanding has it hit us many years ago, because we felt that Israel is emptying the meaning of international law. So Israel has developed a special, school of thought about how to make international law fit any type of violation and war crime that you want to commit. And it all has to do with the wording. And we know that legal strategies is a lot of time about how you interpret things. And unfortunately, Israel has misinterpreted international law intent and content in really an impressive way over the years. So I don't think that we have legal strategies that are going to help us. I think we have political strategies that can help us. And Amnesty here is a super important organization, because whenever we talk to diplomats, not from Canada in particular, because if I recall correctly, Canada even submitted an amicus to the ICC saying that it has no jurisdiction, if I remember, some Erwin Kotler or something. But maybe maybe it was not Canada officially, maybe it was just a group of Canadians. We have other things that we can do. And when we meet more sympathetic diplomats from other countries, they're saying our government totally understand what you're saying, and you're absolutely correct with your analysis, but we don't have the constituency to do that. Nobody is really demanding that. But Amnesty is a very important player in that regard, because you have the strength to create public opinion. And if public opinion shifts, and I can say that if there's something which is if we want to see some, glimmer of light at the end of the tunnel, public opinion about this issue is changing worldwide, also within Israel, by the way, then it's that, make the demand from your government to fulfill its obligation as a third party. Make the demand from companies to meet their human rights obligation in trade, in social responsibility. And also each and every one of us can make choices that sometimes have and can have an impact.
Thank you so much, Roy, for taking all these questions. And I've got a couple of private messages coming up at me just saying, thank you for such an excellent presentation and for such an accessible explanation of what's happening. So thank you very much from us. Unless you want to make a couple of closing remarks, I will pass it to Michael to close up our event.
Just thank you.
Okay.
Okay, thanks, Kim. Yeah, I'll just reiterate what others have just said just now, and thank Roy. I'm a member of the executive of Amnesty International Edmonton and of Palestine Solidarity Network. So on behalf of both organizations, I'd like to thank you for really stimulating this presentation. And hopefully now that those people that didn't really know what the work of TSELEM did, they'll be much more enlightened after hearing you. I'd also like to thank Kim and Jeff for their organizational skills in getting this event a success. And of course, particularly like to thank Rob for initiating the contact with you and making the suggestion that we should have this kind of event with you from, well, the other side of the world almost. And lastly, thanks to all the people that attended. We hoped we might have had a few more, but certainly those that did attend, I'm sure, found it very worthwhile. And their questions were really quite interesting. So hopefully we can stage another one of these events cooperatively. And hopefully in the next one, maybe we'll see that the tide is turning further in favor of justice for Palestine and That's all we can hope for the future at the moment, I guess. Okay, thanks again, Roy.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Good night to you, Roy, and have a nice day, everyone.
Thanks.